thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me, and for everyone that's tuning in. I'll jump right into my presentation, Capri Battery, Powering Decolonial Display Practices through Multisensory Interaction. So according to the dominant Western paradigm of aesthetic reception, what distinguishes artworks from everyday objects is that they provide aesthetic experiences exclusively through visual perception. Correspondingly, Fluxus objects are customarily exhibited on plinth and inside vitrines, despite the fact that they often consist of appropriated everyday objects and were made for so-called viewers to interact with in both sensory ways. How then might everyday objects, which are designed for users to interact with in visual as well as tactile, proprioceptive, auditory, olfactory, and gustatory ways, help Fluxus objects challenge the privilege of the ocular and aesthetic perception and inform contemporary display practices? While art's prohibition on physical interaction is commonly considered a conservation measure, it's also criticized for being rooted in colonialist and racial hierarchies of the senses that privilege sight over marginalized sensory modalities, historically considered non-Western. The Western association of sight, and to a lesser degree hearing, with reason and rationality, and touch, taste, and smell with bodily pleasures, irrationality, and unreliable sensory input, have disembodied aesthetic experiences and shape artworks and conservation and display practices to this day. It then comes as no surprise that traditional reception theories focus on vision. In his 1986 essay, The Work of Art and its Beholder, The Methodology of the Aesthetic of Reception, the art historian Wolfgang Kemp identifies the forms of address with which artworks form an offer of reception, capable of, quote, activating the beholder to take part in their construction, unquote. These include such things as composition, perspective, and depicted figures or elements that orient the viewer, direct their gaze, and provide clues on how to read the work. Yet the overarching form of address is the aesthetics of indeterminacy, or the quote-unquote blanks of aesthetic representation, which the work deploys to, quote, trigger acts of ideation and consequently be finished by the beholder, unquote. So through forms of address, the work invites the viewer to perform a certain role that will complete it. Significantly, the viewer brings more than their open eyes to their reception/perception of the work. They bring what Kemp calls their inner preconditions. Moreover, alongside inner preconditions, Kemp describes the extrinsic conditions of access. He notes that artworks are accessible to the viewer, quote, under conditions that are mostly safeguarded by institutions, and that in themselves require certain patterns of behavior. Extrinsic conditions of access comprise, for example, the architectural surround and the corresponding ritual behavior expected by the institutions of art, unquote. Consider the modern gallery space, where objects are displayed on plinth, inside vitrines, or behind rows. These means of display, to which Kemp refers to as context markers, imply the corresponding behavior of exclusively visual perception. In his 1988 book, The Design of Everyday Things, the usability engineer Donald Norman identifies the principles of interaction with which designers form the discoverability of the everyday objects, which communicates to the user, quote, what it does, how it works, and what operations are possible, unquote. Oops, sorry. So affordances are the relationship between an object's properties and the agent's capabilities. So handsaws, for example, afford sewing if users have a basic understanding of the physics of cutting and an able hand. In other words, provided that users have the relevant inner and, as it were, outer preconditions. Constraints prescribe the user's role by restricting possible actions. So physical constraints restrict things like how parts can be put together and how objects can be moved or manipulated. So a 3-pronged plug will only fit into a 3-hole socket. Yet cultural constraints, akin to social norms or conventions, are learned artificial restrictions on behavior that govern our interactions. To illustrate the distinction, consider the modern exhibition space, which may contain physical constraints such as glass vitrines preventing us from physical interaction. Yet the cultural constraint on physically interacting with exhibits is enough in itself to enforce the quote-unquote correct behavior, even without physical constraints. And indeed, these constraints comprise what Kemp calls extrinsic conditions of access. Feedback communicates the results of our actions. Positive feedback confirms we're acting correctly, whereas negative feedback, or the lack of positive feedback, indicates we should adjust our actions, or alternatively, that there's a fault with the system. Consider elevator buttons lighting up to confirm a request. Feedback may also be auditory, olfactory, gustatory, or haptic, so sounds, odors, or vibrations. And it may also be natural, like the elevator's upward or downward movement. So smooth and quiet operations provide positive feedback, whereas strident sounds, hurt odors, or turbulent motions indicate that we should adjust our actions or fix the system. Mapping refers to the correspondence between two sets of things and is therefore a key principle in designing controls and displays. Some mappings use color. Yellow files go in the yellow cabinet, and others correspond to universal conventions. Turning dials clockwise leads to an increase, and anti-clockwise leads to a decrease. Mappings may also follow spatial analogies, which is why the buttons in the elevator are arranged in ascending numerical order. Lastly, the mental model is a simplified explanation of how something works. For example, the computer desktop. It displays graphic representations of files within folders, which explain how to interact with computers. While mental models may be provided through manuals or similar designs we've interacted with in the past, they should ideally be inferable from the design itself. And the easiest way to acquire a mental model is from the design's perceived structure, so its affordances, constraints, and mappings. So designers use principles of interaction that appeal to users' preconditions to form a discoverability that guides users in executing the functions of everyday objects. Comparably, artists use forms of address that appeal to viewers' preconditions to form an offer of reception that guides viewers in completing the meanings of artworks. Therefore, perhaps applying Norman's principles to the analysis of artworks can reveal how they solicit intellectual agency through multisensory perception. So approximating viewer with user and accordingly artist with designer might reveal how artists prescribe an intellectual role through physical interaction. I'll focus on Capri Battery, created in 1985 by Joseph Beuys, a German avant-gardist known for his involvement with 1960s Fluxus. Although not officially Fluxus, the work represents similar concerns raised by Fluxus works in institutions and on display. Beuys gifted friends and acquaintances 200 copies of the work, which consist of a yellow light bulb, a black socket adapter, and a lemon encased in a wooden box and accompanied by the tongue-in-cheek inscription, "Change battery every 1,000 hours." While Beuys chose to display one copy with no box or inscription in a vitrine, in gifting most copies boxed and unplugged, Beuys turns the ordinarily passive beholders into active agents. Nevertheless, institutions commonly display the work on a plinth inside a vitrine and often with a plastic rather than a ready lemon. From a practical perspective, these institutional display decisions prevent damage and save institutions from continually replenishing the decaying exhibit with fresh lemons. However, from a critical perspective, the quote-unquote conservationist display decisions are questionable because multiple copies exist, because the work is easily replicable using off-the-shelf items, and because Beuys designed it for physical interaction and arguably appropriated the lemon for its ephemeral and multisensorial properties. At first sight, there's something amusing about the work. Yet surely amusement isn't the ultimate response point Beuys aimed to elicit. Presumably, the twin yellow bulbs are a color-coded message, or rather a form of mapping, of supporting the mental model. As the title and inscription suggest, the work is to act as or represent a battery. In including a standard light bulb and socket adapter, but swapping soft for a lemon, Boyce's mapping supports the mental model of a lemon battery, which we all vaguely recall from the primary school science experiment. Yet, despite this inner precondition of familiarity with the model of a lemon battery, and even though the reception took place outside the traditional site of reception, where the site-specific cultural constraint on touch isn't enforced, art's prohibition on physical interaction is so deep-seated that recipients may still have been apprehensive about breaching the cultural constraint, and of course breaching the physical constraint of plugging a two-prong plug into a lemon rather than a corresponding socket. Yet again, the mapping between the color, shape, and size of the lemon and light bulb is Boyce's way of winking at the recipients to eliminate any apprehension. That said, Capri Battery isn't actually engineered to function as a lemon battery. Consequently, we can imagine recipients feeling bemused rather than further amused when they follow Boyce's prescription, only to encounter a lack of positive feedback when the light bulb emits no light, and natural negative feedback from the stinging sensation and sour smell of the lemon juice dripping down their hands. Yet, perhaps instead of considering this feedback as indicating incorrect action, we should consider Boyce deliberately designed a dysfunctional lemon battery to afford a cognitive dissonance that triggers acts of ideation. By forming a false offer of reception, Boyce prescribed interacting agents and ultimately intellectual role in completing the work. Since negative feedback and the lack of positive feedback indicate we should adjust our actions, perhaps Capri Battery wasn't designed to prescribe an action that completes it as such, but rather to be a call for action, calling to change our actions and fix the broken energy system. It could be said that the proverbial light bulb lighting above the recipients' heads when they realized this is what filled in the quote-unquote blank. Indeed, according to the work's accepted reading, informed by the fact Boyce was an environmentalist and a founding member of the German Green Party, it calls for a reconsideration of fossil fuels as an energy source. Designed on the Mediterranean island of Capri, where strong sunlight provides favorable conditions for the cultivation of lemons, the choice of two round bright yellow balls can be understood as another layer of mapping that validates this environmental reading by alluding specifically to solar power as an alternative, more sustainable source of energy. It does this by supporting the mental model of the sun as a renewable energy source. So the lemon represents the sun's energy in its stored form, the light bulb represents the sun energy as a light source, and together they represent the circularity of the sun's physical mechanism of operation. On this account, the choice of a lemon and a yellow incandescent light bulb creates multi-layered mapping that both prescribes physical interaction by supporting the mental model of a lemon battery and triggers a specific environmental act of ideation by supporting the corollary mental model of the sun as a battery. Even so, if we consider our instrumental, at least insofar that they can be used as a vehicle for social change, then we could say that agents driven to action by the work take part not only in its completion, but also in the literal execution of its function. So, through the various design decisions embodied in the work, Boyce prescribed physical interaction. Yet, this physical interaction ultimately led recipients to perform an intellectual role that completed the work. By prescribing an intellectual role through multisensory perception, the work demonstrates that intellectual agency need not be solicited exclusively through visual perception, and that its customary institutional display undermines the potential social, political, and environmental impact of its intended reception. To conclude, I hope this case study demonstrates how thinking of interactive artworks, particularly those representing Fluxus concern, as designed objects, can inform contemporary display practices that will help re-embody aesthetic experiences and decolonize the anachronistic yet still pervasive visualist paradigm of aesthetic reception/perception. Thank you very much.